And Martin, we'll start with you.
Right. So first, on behalf of the Center for Governance and Markets, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this next installment of the Future Law Seminar Series. The Center for Governance and Markets is a relatively new center at the University of Pittsburgh, and we seek to understand the diverse institutions and governance arrangements that affect the social order and human well-being in the United States and around the world. We typically take more of a bottom-up type of a approach to it, very strongly influenced by the intellectual traditions of Elinor Ostrom and Friedrich Hayek. And so the host of this series, our fearless leader is my colleague and friend, Mike Madison. We've known each other for probably 25 years now, pretty much since he came to the University of Pittsburgh. And we always threatened to collaborate with each other, and I think we finally achieved it. So,
yes, exactly.
So with that, with that short introduction, let me hand it off to Mike.
Okay, well, thank you, Martin. Yeah, it's a great pleasure to be collaborating with you on this project. So I am Mike Madison. I am a law professor at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. I direct something called the Future Law Project, which is partly an institutional home at Pitt for a larger scale research project called the Workshop on Governing Knowledge Commons, which is derivative, as Martin said, of an interest in institutional analysis in the tradition of Elinor Ostrom. This workshop series brings diverse speakers from around the world with perspectives on institutional analysis of various sorts. Today's speakers, super excited to welcome a team, Saba Siddiki and Christopher Franz. Saba is an associate professor of public administration and international affairs at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University in Syracuse, New York. Chris Franz is get this right, associate professor in the Department of Computer Science at, see if I get the name of the university correct. Chris, you'll correct me here. Why don't I just invite you to volunteer the name of your institution so we get it correct?
That's right. It's the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. NTNU is the acronym that's most commonly referenced, but yeah, doesn't matter. Thank you very much.
Fabulous, thank you. They are the co-leaders of a fascinating research project called the Institutional Grammar Research Initiative, and that's what they are here today to talk about. So with that introduction, I will turn it over to the two of them. We'll hear 25 minutes or so of presentation by them, and then we'll open the conversation for Q&A. So Saba and Christopher, I'll turn it over to the two of you to take us forward.
Well, great. Thank you very much, Michael and Martin. It's such a pleasure to be here. And so just as Michael said, we're going to talk a bit about a research initiative that Christopher and I are co-directing, which is really focused on growing a knowledge commons for advancing institutional analysis. And as part of today's talk, we're going to give a very brief introduction to this research initiative and what we're doing, the focus of this initiative, talk a little bit about institutional analysis as a basis for introducing the institutional grammar. And then what we're really going to be doing is showcasing applications of the institutional grammar in a variety of ways to give you all a sense of the value of this particular tool for understanding governance of social systems. The name of our initiative is the Institutional Grammar Research Initiative, which was founded in 2018, really as a forum to convene scholars from different disciplines and from institutions around institutions around the world who are fundamentally interested in advancing methods and theory for the study and practice of institutional analysis, and particularly for advancing this tool called the institutional grammar. So you all are familiar with what institutions are and what institutional analysis is, but just as a very brief baseline here, when we're talking about institutions, we're definitely talking about rules, norms, and shared strategies that are governing social systems, and with the idea that institutional analysis then is the study of the intended and manifest design of institutions, as well as institutional antecedents and institutional outcomes. And what we're going to be talking about today with the institutional grammar is basically one theoretically grounded methodological approach that really helps us to study the intended and manifest design of institutions as a basis for investigating institutional antecedents and outcomes. So the institutional grammar fundamentally is based on the premise that institutions are conveyed in language. That could be spoken language when we're talking about institutions of a social convention sort, or written language when we're talking about institutions that are embodied in policy, law, regulation, and the like. And on that premise, the institutional grammar provides a theoretically grounded approach for understanding institutional language through an institutional syntax. And I'll describe that in more detail. But before I do that, I mean, really, I think a key idea with the institutional grammar is that institutions are fundamentally comprised of building blocks, if you will. And through understanding the building blocks of institutions, we're in a better position to understand systematically and in a generalizable way how it is that institutions govern social systems, including sort of constituting features of social systems, as well as regulating behavior of actors within them. So the idea here really is that institutions are comprised of institutional statements. So in the policy, law, regulation realm, right, these could be akin to policy directives or policy provisions, legal provisions, but fundamentally what these are linguistically conveyed constraints or opportunities that are really describing actions for actors within the presence or absence of particular constraints, or parameterizing features of particular systems. And that furthermore, those institutional statements are comprised of common building blocks, that is, building blocks that are common to institutional statements that are observed in institutions of different sorts and across different domains. And those building blocks of institutional statements are these institutional syntactic components along which institutional statements are investigated. The IG supports two kinds of syntaxes, one to accommodate the analysis of what we refer to as regulative institutional statements, that is, those that regulate actions for actors by describing, for example, what individuals can, cannot, may, must not do within particular situations. And also another syntax that embeds here describes components of constitutive institutional statements, which are statements that constitute or parameterize features of social systems by, for example, defining artifacts, creating roles, defining roles and responsibilities, creating decision-making venues, and the like. And the syntactic components that accord with these different types of institutional statements are designed to pick up on the key functional sort of properties of these different types of statements. So it is presumed in the IG that regulative institutional statements, those that play this regulating function, are comprised of some mix of these syntactic components that you see listed in the top box, attributes, which are actors, aims, which are actions, objects, which are receivers of actions, context clauses that identify conditions or constraints that qualify the actions of these statements, and then deontics that signal the prescriptiveness of action associated with action that assigns to different actors within statements. Constitutive statements, on the other hand, are composed of some mix of the syntactic components that you see in blue in the bottom box, and those are constituted entities. These are the entities that are actually created through these institutional statements, or constituted more generally. Constituting properties, which are basically qualities assigned to those entities. Constitutive functions, which are acts that functionally link entities and properties. These also contain these context clauses that qualify the actions that are indicated in those constitutive functions, and then modals that signal the potentiality or necessity of the action, the constituting, if you will, action that's reflected in the function. So a basic kind of grammar analysis, IG analysis of institutions, would take an institution of interest, say, for example, a policy document, break that down into institutional statements, and then further parse different types of institutional statements, regulative or constitutive, according to these syntactic components, with the idea that through investigation of these building blocks, we have a much better way, we have a rigorous, reliable, and systematic way of capturing information that's conveyed in institutions, which then can be analyzed in various ways to support different sorts of analytical objectives. So what we're going to do in this presentation for the purpose of exemplification is sort of walk through different types of analyses of institutional information that results from an institutional grammar coding of institutions, as a way to just show you what are the analytical possibilities and the utility of the IG more broadly. And we're going to engage in this multi-part analysis, institutional analysis, drawing on regulation. So a formal institution, if you will, that is from the U.S. organic farming domain. So in the U.S. organic farming domain, there is a regulatory program referred to the National Organic Program. And this is basically a voluntary certification-based regulatory program created through this regulation that is then implemented by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And what we are interested in doing in our institutional analysis is understanding the design of this regulation with respect to how it structures the roles and responsibilities of different types of actors within this regulatory domain, as well as understanding how this regulation, this kind of institution, is sort of setting up features of the regulatory domain. In the United States, as in many other countries, organic farming is growing in market salience as consumers are recognizing the social, health, environmental benefits that accrue from consumption of organic products. And so it's the program in itself has grown in salience over time. But I'm going to also just provide a very brief history on this regulatory domain by way of context for one of the analyses that we're going to show you later on. So this is an interesting program in the sense that it is born out of social movement. So this regulatory program came about at the request of farmers in the US in the 1980s who were producing products organically without a regulatory program in place. And wanted a formalized certification program at the national level through which organic farmers producing foods and products in a particular way could be awarded this certification. You see here the USDA Organics label, as a way to consistently signal to consumers that organic products had consistent quality and consistent standards to which they're subject to. And so it was essentially driven by a group of farmers that were not only committed to this sort of regulation, but also farmers that in already practicing organic food production were committed to the social health and environmental benefits associated with organic food production. But recognizing the increasing sort of market salience of this program, we've seen over time new industry entrants, farmers that are interested in capitalizing on the growing market salience and driven more by a profit motive. And so it is a domain where we see a different set of actors or regulatees participating. And this is a dynamic that we will be particularly investigating in our institutional analysis. So with that, I'll turn it over to Chris, who will walk you through this multi-part analysis of institutional design and outcomes in the space that we engaged.
Thank you, Saba. So the idea is now that we look at it both from the angle of the organic farming policy, of course, but see how we can pair this with different techniques that all in one way or another reference the institutional grammar in its use, and to leverage understanding of the institutional arrangements and the data underlying it. And referencing back to the institutional syntax that Saba introduced earlier, we would assume that we need to encode an entire policy, in this instance, a subset thereof, 202 regulative statements at that time, in following the syntactic prescription that was introduced before. And it allows us, or provides us a basis to do perform an initial statistical, if you like, analysis that operates, for instance, on the components individually. We get a sense of the policy and the regulated actors and the kind of policy language to some extent as well. For instance, a very classic analysis that you would find in classical ID studies, if you like, is that you would identify or rank the most commonly referenced attributes, which are the responsible actors, the ones that are kind of regulated as part of an institutional statement, as well as the deontics and direct objects. For example, here we know that about 1/3 of all the statements basically reference the program manager as one really important and central actor in the entire policy. But I also clarify that a dominant deontic, for instance, is the deontic shell, signal a moderate level, or possibly, depending on the contextual interpretation of what shell means for a given policy, a highly prescriptive level of instructions imposed upon, for example, the program manager, as opposed to a may, which would signal a higher level of discretion, permissiveness, if you liked. And of course, we also can identify the artifacts that are of central relevance in this policy. For example, the notification evidently plays an important and central role. So, of course, this is the kind of most reductionist approach of looking at policy in the first place. But we can look at this in a more fine-grained or a composite way as well, by actually combining different the different components and see their ranking respectively. So we can, for example, see the most common association of an actor and actor and the associated activities that this actor has to perform, for instance. But of course, also pair an actor with the with the objects that it operates on. For example, we know that an organic programs governing state official probably most commonly deals in some way or fashion with a notification. So again, a reference to a very important instrument. And you'll see we can offer an arbitrary level of depth in this association, the ranking and exploration. But this will only give us a very high level snapshot, if you like, of essential features of an encoded policy, if you like. But we can use the same mechanism now by using appropriate tooling to generate an entire policy network, if you like, or the institutional setting as it's in its file is encoded, of course, and relevant for the analysis in a graph structure such as this one here, this network structure, where circles reflect actors, that is animate actors, so that are relevant in an institutional setting and that are linked based on the activities that are regulated. For instance, we see a link emanating from the program manager on the top right that initiates some sort of suspension towards a certifying agent. So where the label on the link signals the activity and the rectangular boxes signal the associated concepts or institutional artifacts that are of relevance, notifications, suspensions, revocations. So it gives you a static snapshot of the entire institutional setting, possibly as intended, since we are deriving it from policy directly. So, this is one branch of the analysis that you will commonly find in IG studies. You see that you increasingly can, extract in a bottom-up fashion from individual institutional statements, the entire system perspective to varying degrees with varying extents and varying biases, because you could introduce filters and only selectively encode certain or prominently encode certain aspects. But the IG can also be leveraged in different ways, and that's something we decided to showcase here in exemplary form by looking at modeling more explicitly. So if we think about a policy that we evaluate based on its form only, as done right now, we of course get only one side of the institution. We only see the institution in form, but not so much the institution in use. And the ability to evaluate the performance of the institution, of course, hinges on the it's actually workings in the practice, right? It's actually success in practice. And to this extent, we draw on institutional modeling as a kind of companion approach to pair the data that's extracted from the institutional statements with behavioral data, as you will see. So we draw on the technique of agent-based modeling. The IG is inherently agnostic about the different techniques that are employed there. It could be a classical game theoretical account. We could also look at macro level modeling approaches such as system dynamics, but we take this bottom-up approach because it corresponds quite nicely to the individual, allows, as you can imagine, a very convenient mapping of the individual statements on individual actors and their responsibilities. So agent-based modeling, if you haven't heard about it, is basically the idea of reconstructing in a human setting, a human society in the widest sense, in our case with an institutional bias, in an artificial form, in a simulation setting. So by extracting the characteristics of human agents that are relevant for the analysis and basically embedding them, implementing them, injecting them into agents that then act as proxies for those human actors. And naturally, they're made up in very heterogeneous forms in as far as relevant for the institutional scenario, of course. We can't model comprehensive humans, but we can model features that are of value to us. And they exhibit a certain level of autonomy. They make choices, take decisions on their own. And they are embedded in an environment where the environment can be very concrete. It could be, if we reference the organic farming program as an example, a concrete geospatial arrangement of different farms, if you like, but it can also be inherently abstract, similar to the kind of network structure I just highlighted before, that simply signals the network relationships between individual agents and suggests how they can communicate, for instance. So it's very abstracted. As you will imagine, one of the challenges in agent-based modeling, I'm not obscuring this fact, is of course if you attempt to remodel a human society or even an institutional setting with sufficient complexity, you will run out of, oftentimes you will not have the necessary data to substantiate all the different choices you would want to make. That's an ideal case, but it also allows you to inject theory to some extent to kind of fill those gaps and to explore nevertheless the interaction between the institutions in form and in use, based of course with those on those possible gaps. So models can be very theoretical in kind or very empirical in kind. We offer a mixture of both just to exemplify it here. So naturally, any model or any research, I guess, is driven by research questions. It's better be so in any case. But the question that we posed here was basically coming back to Saba's earlier introduction, that the organic farming system in particular, in the context of the National Organic Program, has changed over time, where it was initially driven primarily by near-altruistic motives, at least pro-social motives. It was increasingly attracting individuals that are more opportunistic in the sense that they could draw or realize an additional profit margin based on the organic branding that comes along with the entire program. So the question that we're exploring is basically, can we systematically vary regulatee composition in a kind of what-if analysis, a hypothetical setting, that are made up in terms of different social value orientations that are primarily interested in, and to see in how far this affects the institutional outcomes at large. So that's the kind of beauty of those this modeling approach, that you can explore aspects that are hypothetical entirely or inherently hard to perform in practice. And then you can, of course, subject this model that you develop to various questions of that kind, and also to varying parameterization of independent variables, right? So we could look at monitoring and sanctioning intensity, but in this instance, for the sake of the introduction here, we merely focus on the regulatee composition as one of those features. So naturally, we need data. So part of the data that we're using is the prescribed behavior that we want to subject agents to, so they know what the correct behavior is, basically the entire institutional setting as intended and formalized in institutional statements. That's basically extracted from the coding. And then the complementary qualitative behavior that we actually see in the wild, so the institutions in use, if you like, The data, which is based on earlier studies by Saba Siddiki and David Carter, who actually performed surveys on all the relevant stakeholders, and particular additional qualitative interviews on the producers or operators as they are referenced commonly in the operations as they're referenced in the policy itself. So this is a synonymous use here, of course. But the important thing is that we actually link institutions informed to some extent with the institutions in use perspective, and that leverage basically the analysis of behavior in a wide sense. So looking at the stereotypes, let's develop them a bit. You see here in this matrix, in the first column, you see the stereotypes, as we will call them, we'll reference them as economic, mimetic, and pro-social, and then the associated incentives for compliance that those individuals react to. So we, for example, postulate that there's an inherent duty to comply that may be prevalent in some agents, with perhaps moderate care or concern for reputation in other instances, or susceptibility to social pressure, or ultimately just a fear for penalty. And for an economically motivated actor that ideally, well, in extreme cases, purely selfishly oriented, we would expect it an inherently low intrinsic motivation to comply, but a very high concern for reputation, because on the one hand, of course, for the scheme in the wider sense, for the National Organic Program, but also individually. But a limited concern for social pressure, and ultimately strong motivation based on the fear of penalty, right? So avoiding being caught in whenever non-compliances occur. The countering extreme, of course, would be pro-social agents that are internally motivated, intrinsically motivated to comply. So there's no sense of actually, even reflecting on non-compliance. Reputation concerns are high, social pressure is relevant, but the fear of penalty is naturally low since they are inherently compliant. And the mimetic agents basically adopted both from literature, but also from empirical observation. In fact, if for any innovation that we introduce, we'll find that we have a notion of late adopters, if you like. And the mimetic agents to some extent reflect this. They observe the social environment and largely follow dominant trends or behavior in the social environments. And for these reasons, they kind of represent a bit of a middle pole between those extremes of economically motivated, individualistically motivated agents and pro-social oriented agents. So they basically don't have an intrinsic sense of duty, but they basically care moderately about everything, and primarily focus on the observed environment for the actual decision making. So this brings us briefly to the observed decision making. So I'm running through a bit through the modeling process to give you a sense on the intuition of how this would be happening in practice. But ultimately, any agent then entertains, and here focused on the operation or operator or producer referenced earlier, cycle. So during each iteration, an agent needs to take certain decisions that are uniform. The decision structure, the cycle structure is uniform, but the decision parameterization is individual and particular to the particular stereotypes that I just highlighted. For instance, agents need to decide whether they want to be certified in the system, they need to decide whether they want to act compliantly, and that they can decide as to whether they would want to engage in peer monitoring, which is not inherently unrealistic, that organic farmers would be able to monitor their neighbors purely based on the proximity to adjacent farms, for instance. So one motivation of an economic trader, economic operation to participate would, of course, be the observed cheating behavior. So you don't want to join a national program that actually evidently doesn't kind of work. You want to inherit basically the status of the program. So it's very important that no cheating is observable, whereas the pro-social agent, for instance, would join it under any circumstance. And the mimetic one would basically just see what the dominant fraction of peers, that is farmers in this instance, would do. For the operation, conversely, the economic trader would look on his past experience. It's inherently motivated by the fear of penalty. So the idea is here to act compliantly in as far as its own, bound rationality allows, basically its own memory of the past interaction that it had. Whereas, of course, non-compliance is not an option for pro-social actors, if you like. And then similar for the monitoring, this can be motivated because it's, of course, incurs cost by necessity, can be inherently pro-socially motivated, thereby persistent, or again, opportunistically, that, for example, individually motivated actors would seek enforcement if they see an increase of non-compliance or an outright violation in the entire program, so as to assure the reputation of the entire program. So So if we look at those different characteristics, we get a sense how this model could actually play out and look like. We just need to, sorry, I should have zoomed in the first place, so I'll forgo this here. But I hope my narrative conveyed some of the intuitions underlying this modeling. The idea is now to parameterize such a model with distributions of those relevant actors. You may recall that one of the experiments or questions we asked ourselves, how this composition affects the outcomes, compliance outcomes in particular, of this entire second. So we systematically vary the composition of the different agents with respect to primarily economic, mimetic, or pro-social motives, and then of course introduce dominating majority minority relationships accordingly in various permutations. So okay, so what's the kind of insights we get from here, just for the sake of conveying also that the agent-based model actually produces meaningful outcomes to some extent. Again, on the left side, the left column, we see the different profiles of agents that we observe, the economically motivated ones, mimetic and pro-socially ones, and then we observe to the right the levels of non-compliance that we of course measure. And we're not only measuring the overall level of non-compliance, but also drill down into the individual agents and see, in an attempt to see the interactions that we could probably also observe in reality to some extent. And one other aspect that is quite interesting is the convergence rate, which I return to in a second. So if we see, for example, that overall non-compliance highly correlates with dominant presence of economically motivated actors, which is hardly surprising, of course, we can actually see that the more interesting aspect is that it's not so much primarily correlating with the non-compliance of economic actors, but rather it capitalizes on the followership of the mimetic agents that actually realize that there's a dominant fraction of agents that are cheating in the system and also adopts this behavior. So we see that the late adopters and so on can actually be very decisive in deciding the ultimate outcome on convergence results of the entire system. So those could be quite interesting insights. The mimetic agents themselves with respect to their influence on the system is somewhat moderate when it comes to non-compliance, but it becomes quite interesting when it comes to convergence. So convergence rate is basically the performance with which we can observe that the entire institutional arrangement arrives at a high level of compliance or non-compliance, basically once it stabilizes effectively in its performance. And we realize that the polar extremes of social value orientations, such as economically motivated agents and pro-socially ones, actually drive convergence quickly. We quickly know whether the entire system doesn't work or does work based on the dominant presence, but is actually delayed by mimetic agents. So the more mimetic agents you have in the systems, the slower you reach convergence. So it will take you longer to actually identify what a stable level of compliance in the system will be. So what's the interesting insight for any sort of policy analyst? Well, possibly that you need to think about the kind of stakeholders you're engaging and their motives for engaging in the first place in any such program when you design the institutional arrangement, of course, and also the sanctioning regimes, and how far they are relevant, and how far they require level intensity, the trade-offs between the penalty itself and the monitoring frequency, so commonly observed mechanisms by which you can vary regulatory compliance outcomes and so on. So it gives you a bit of an insight of that you need to pay attention to the individual actors that are engaging in this kind of setting. Anyway, then you can of course individually observe the outcomes. It does not surprise that, for example, pro-socially motivated agents drive a more compliant system, and of course high levels of certified agents, where we, for instance, see that if we equally distribute, as shown on the right side here, where the x-axis shows the rounds and the y-axis the number of agents, we see that only a subset of the agents, of course, will be compliant, because ultimately the non-compliant behavior by the individually motivated agents may motivate even the following agents, the mimetic agents, to adopt a non-compliant behavior. So anyway, those are just high-level insights that you can possibly get from it. But now let's return to the institutional grammar again. I just wanted to motivate basically how you can use it for very tangible studies that also invite for tangible insights, not in terms of accuracy, that's a discussion we may have in a QA or not, but for understanding largely. But the institutional grammar, and here depicting an advanced form, which is dubbed the institutional grammar 2.0, which basically builds on the original Crawfordian and Ostromian grammar, but it extends it with considerable facilities to allow computational tractability, but also different forms of analysis, and better aligns with different forms, different techniques associated with this. We can now think about, of course, looking at it from a structural perspective, foremostly, as done and kind of displayed earlier. We showed the network analysis that has been performed. There are variations of this, whereas we can also explore behavioral dynamics if we have a slightly richer encoding that we call IG extended as part of this institutional encoding mechanism. And of course, our intent is, and I think it's particularly relevant for this forum here, is to strive towards a formal assessment of policy, if you like, by allowing the linkage to first of all, drawing in theory and thereby epistemology into the coding directly. So we can bring in your own domain-specific or discipline-specific theory and leverage it for analysis, but also to really have a semantic and syntactic characterization that is rigid enough to allow a logical treatment based, for example, on allow for the modification of policy or statements in a logical way, let alone reasoning on them. So those are kind of the different forms of analysis that the IG, we believe, fosters. And we displayed the first two ones, of course, only at this stage, whereas the last one is, of course, something that's subject to ongoing and future research. So with this, I hope we gave you a bit of a sense of the IGE more generally, but also possible application, at least illustratively. And at this stage, we turn to you, I believe, for questioning, or in any case, for back to the host for moderating this session. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you, Chris and Saba. That's an enormously rich and provocative presentation. So we've got about 20 minutes for questions and answers. So I will step back, and people should raise their hands per the usual Zoom convention, or simply wave if they've got their screen open.
So, I mean, I'll just jump in. I mean, I've done a bit of agent-based modeling myself with spectrum management, and I always appreciate people who are, you know, using this tool for other kinds of things. So I thought your work was fascinating. I look forward to reading more about it. Just out of kind of on a technical level, what tools did you use for this?
So you think about the for the encoding, or do you think for the simulation?
Yeah, well, you know, like, did you use NetLogo? Did you use?
Right.
I mean, what software system did you use?
Yeah. So this particular simulation is implemented in Mason. So so we use Mason mostly because of the high level of performance and the customizability. You know, NetLogo to some extent is good for iterative modeling, in particular for small scale models. But as soon as you think about scalability of models, like large scales of agents, we wanted to reconstruct the institutional setting as it's existent in reality. That means we need to at least have 7,500 agents, I believe, that are organic traders. So we needed something slightly more scalable. Yeah.
Right. Thank you.
So I'll go ahead and ask a question, and it will be a poorly formed question, but I'm hoping that because my Knowledge Commons colleagues, Brett and Kathy, are both on the call, they can align it more precisely. The title slide for the talk referred to Knowledge Commons, and we have previously talked a little bit as a preliminary matter about intersections between institutional grammar research and knowledge commons research. And so I wondered if you could elaborate a little bit on the instinct in your minds that you led off with. How do you characterize the intersections between institutional grammar research and what you understand of the knowledge commons work? You're muted.
I'd be happy to talk about this a little bit. And if Chris, you wouldn't mind bringing up our slides about the institutional grammar itself and what our mission and foci. I'll start by just giving you a little bit better sense of what the Grammar Initiative is doing in terms of our mission and key activities, and how the various kinds of ways that we're engaging scholars as a platform to answer your question, Mike. So the initiative is really built around a few focal areas. So we are engaging scholars from different disciplines, again, from different institutions around the world, around sort of development of computational text analysis tools. So really developing applications of computational text analysis, as well as supervised machine learning approaches for evaluating institutions. Also recognizing the theoretical foundations of the IG, we're engaged in what we call evaluating institutional performance, utilizing the IG to develop theoretically informed metrics for then assessing the quality of institutions or characteristics of institutions based on the structural features that we're identifying through computational and other means, and then sort of exploring this linkage between real and simulated behavior, between institutions and real and simulated behavior in field settings, simulated environments, et cetera. And all of these activities and the way that we are engaging them, engaging scholars in them, is, I would say, designed to be really inclusive in terms of really trying to accommodate different analytical interests. So in part to showcase the generalizability of the institutional grammar, both from a theoretical as well as methodological perspective, but also so that we have a way of collecting information, collecting insights, collecting research, and this body of research essentially, and having some sort of venue to share that research with one another. So that's one sort of way we're getting toward generating this knowledge commons. The other thing that is really focal to the IGRI work is that it is founded on these principles of commons-based peer production, and sort of the development of intellectual products that are open source and open access and can be collaboratively developed over time as a result of those properties. So in addition to sort of generating knowledge and exchanging it, once we create the intellectual products, we have a very deliberative focus on engaging scholars in the continued developments of derivatives of these initial products. And so that is another way we're sort of engaging, a commons perspective, if you will, in the initiative. Does that help to answer your question, Michael?
Sure. No, I mean, I guess my one reflection back is that within the knowledge commons community, we have a very sort of similar perspective. There's sort of layers from our perspective. There's the in a commons environment, whether you're talking a traditional Ostrom style natural resource environment or a more contemporary knowledge and information-based knowledge and resource environment, there is the question of governance of the resource itself, so the manner in which it's accessed, produced, distributed, and stored. Then there's the layer above, which is to say that the governance resources themselves are sort of a knowledge resource, as it were. Right. And then there's yet what you're identifying, and we've sort of anecdotally identified something complementary in our work. There's a layer above that, which is to say that the analysis of the governance as well as the analysis of the resource itself is itself a species of shared resource. Right. That can be, and so you can keep stacking these, of course, up and down the register in a way. I think simply being aware of the several layers of approach is itself a critical insight, because a lot of, I would say, I shall say, this is a generality, but I'd say a lot of earlier institutional analysis was insufficiently aware of the multiplicity of layers that goes into taking apart a complex social system or a complex resource environment. And so then the question is, with respect to, say, the knowledge commons work and the IGRI work, or anyone else in any other research environment that is studying institutions in a comparative sense, there will obviously be ways for the different research programs to intersect. Sure. The openness, the shareability of the research products, of course, creates the potential, and then you simply have to be thoughtful about the levels at which you're coordinating your perspectives. I guess I have one more question, but I don't want to appropriate the entirety of the Q&A time. But I was actually very interested in the case study example that you used, the organic farming analysis, because and possibly for a reason that was a little bit different than what you had in mind when you chose that case and then researched it. I'm an intellectual property lawyer coming to these governance questions, And so I look at the slide that you had about organic farming, and to me, the first thing I notice is the label. Right, there's a certification project. It's not only about the substantive content of the agricultural practices and the food products that result. It's about the certification process. It's about compliance with standards and about the mechanisms, legal and otherwise, that ensure that display of the certification is lawful and legitimate and consistent with the normative aspirations of the program, et cetera, et cetera. I have always thought, as an IP lawyer, that all of the sort of agricultural certification projects, geographical indications around the world, which have different manifestations in trademark law or GI law in Europe, in the US, and elsewhere, whether it's for organics or for specific food products, cheeses, meats, olive oils, coffees, teas, et cetera, is a really rich source for case study analysis of institutions and institutional dynamics. And so I wondered what motivated you to pick that particular case. So what were your initial instincts about why that would be an interesting way to go?
Yeah, well, so this is actually, this study originally was modeled after my dissertation work, which was done in the context of aquaculture. So fish farming, shellfish farming, aquatic plant farming. And there I was really interested in understanding and operationalizing sort of delta parameters. If you're familiar with this from the Crawford and Ostrom work, but basically intrinsic and extrinsic motivations that drive compliance with institutions, and thinking about how, if there's something about the way institutions are designed that sort of influences how people comply with them, taking into account their intrinsic and extrinsic motivations. And so I was looking for another context where there was the potentiality that your targets, your regulatory targets, do have these various intrinsic and extrinsic motivations that might drive their behavior within regulatory contexts. So it was sort of it was these case dynamics around sort of the social dynamics within the regulatory setting that were somewhat analogous to the aquaculture case, that provided a nice way to kind of assess whether those dissertation findings were also going to generalize to other settings, but then sort of build on that research in different ways. And the great thing about, partnering with Chris on this is, his institutional modeling allowed us to do what I couldn't do in the field, which is sort of then engage in this experimentation. So, and that was that collaboration, I will say, it was our early collaborations that really spurred an interest in making the IG more computationally tractable. So, the first spreadsheet I gave Chris, we were just starting to work together. So he was very shy to tell me that this is computationally useless because everything is so coded at such a coarse level that from a computational perspective, you start thinking, engaging computational tools on the data collection side or use side, or even the logical sort of representation, all of these things that you might think about using computational applications for was very difficult. So this sort of got us on the path of thinking, well, how do we make institutional analysis more computationally tractable? And how can we leverage the IG as a basis in doing this work?
Yeah, so you've hit on something that in our Knowledge Commons work we've come up against, which is that I think because we come from an intellectual property perspective, Kathy and Brett and I are all sort of initially we were attracted to this partly because of Benkler and common space peer production, and then trying to generalize beyond. Yochai's work turns out to be somewhat more narrow and case specific than people thought initially, but that's fine. But of course, that world, for reasons of history and path dependence, that world, the IP policy world, is very much focused on extrinsic motivations. And then there's been this dawning realization in recent years that intrinsic motivations are significant. And then something, as we've done the Knowledge Commons case studies, we're still very much in the qualitative approach to all of this. But it's clear to us that almost all of the case studies that we work through, that intrinsic motivations really tend to dominate in these collective management situations. And so that brings us to the point where that intersects with what you just described, which is if we want to try to build a model that is more systemic, where almost all of what we're gathering is information about intrinsic motivations, how do you convert understanding, which is really to our sort of lay understanding, qualitative detail about the world, focus on unobservable beliefs and histories and so forth. How do you convert that? How do you externalize that into a more formal system, whether it's computational or otherwise? And it sounds like you found a way to do that, I guess, is what I'm observing. And that's what I'm interested in hearing more about, how you bridge what I think of as a pretty substantial gap.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think what was nice here is that I had sort of done this regulatory coding and these interviews and this survey, this sort of field work, extensive field work with some colleagues that I was working on that project with prior to our engagement on this. And it was through that field work that I really honed in on particular dynamics that I was interested in studying, but didn't have the methodological tools to. And that field work then became the basis for contextualizing and basically parameterizing a lot of the key features of this model. But Chris, perhaps you want to say more about this?
Yeah, I think that's really, to some extent, the origin in a way, because agent-based modeling really builds on this bottom-up metaphor. I mean, it's primarily inspired from a socio-normative perspective, if you want to interpret norms in institutional sense. So, and less from the classical legal institutional perspective, where this is more seen as railguards that, to some extent, limit and constrain and define the institutional setting in which the agents operate in the first place. But to really learn and explore, we commonly look at emergent properties of some sort, some kind. In the case of regulatory compliance, is as easy as they could be. We literally look just at compliance behavior. It's very convenient from an analytical standpoint. But I think it's also part of the reason that the grammar has now, we have developed the grammar also conceptually, or redeveloped to some extent, that it seeks parity between, on the one hand, the rule-based characterization and normative characterization as well, by aligning the structure representation, right? So you may, if you're familiar with the original IG, for instance, it doesn't really pay too much, at least explicit attention to sanctioning for near socio-normative behavior in a way. But we of course realize if you want to develop at least some sort of way of measuring the delta between the behavior you are prescribing, the one you're actually observing, you kind of need to have parity in representation, right? You cannot measure if you miss one feature on either side of the formal informal spectrum. So I think this is also one of the refinements of the institutional grammar that we have aimed at performing. We now just need the data to kind of populate it on parity to allow a hard comparison, right? Yeah. So right now there's this bridge that needs to be performed, but as far as the representation goes, the IG should be there. Yeah.
Yeah. But you're still struggling. We all struggle with the data that you have access to is observed behavior, which is always going to be an indirect reflection of actual mental processes. I did an early case study in the knowledge common space. I did a case study of a astronomy citizen science project. And it's fantastically successful. They've been listed tens of thousands of people in the citizen science project to do real scientific research. And if you look at the whole system carefully, what you realize is that the tens of thousands of volunteers who are motivated to participate are motivated by some intrinsic model in their own minds. They are in fact amateur scientists, and they're getting to participate in authentic scientific research project. How do you actually capture that in a formal, systematic way is, of course, extremely difficult. You can observe, participation in scientific papers. You can observe people who go back to education and finish degrees and so forth. Some of these people did, in fact, go on to do PhDs, having been motivated to enlist in the citizen science projects. But you see the same gap, right? That you can document the behaviors and then use that to tell the story, but you're still you can't ever really get inside people's heads, even though that's right. Authentically what turns out to be critically important.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Thank you for following up on that too, Mike. I mean, in the case of this one, we basically asked people, why do you come? Like, what's your motivation? Like, why are you participating? And so we asked, in asking them why they're complying, we particularly phrased questions that we thought would get at various kinds of intrinsic and extrinsic motivations. But at the end of the day, this is self-reported and difficult to validate. We were able to triangulate some of it by looking at these patterns and responses, and that's what those agent profiles are drawing on to some extent. But there's always clearly some limitation associated with that.
Yeah. Anyway, I think I've gotten myself carried away with things that interest me. I want to make sure we've got a couple of minutes left. Martin or anyone else, if you have questions, we definitely have some space for those. Anybody? Chris and Saba, did you have anything else that you wanted to help us close with and leave us with?
Well, I mean, I think if I may just, I think one thing that was exciting for us about presenting in this forum is because it is sort of thinking about, it's intersecting various topics that we are very interested in, leveraging technology to study institutions that are engaged in governance. And given the nature of my background and the nature of my previous work and my own background, some of the institutions that we are examining are laws, are legal documents. And so, I mean, it's really, this is really an honor to present in this forum, given that this community is also sort of looking at the intersection of those topics, albeit from a different angle.
Yeah. No, well, I'm super excited that you were available to share your work with this group today, and we'll capture it obviously in the recording and continue to make it available. And ideally, there will be opportunities for follow-on conversations and collaboration of various sorts. I know that here at Pitt, Martin and I have been part of an informal and now somewhat more formal research collaborative across different units about governance in institutions. Role of technology. We've talked a little bit about agent-based modeling as a possible approach to use in some cases. And I find myself, what the interesting thing for me, as Martin knows well, I am not a PhD researcher. I'm a JD. I'm an ordinary law professor. And so I find myself pulled ever more directly into the world of social science, which I find really stimulating and inspiring and interesting, because to me, it is a very different angle on not only legal institutions, but a very different angle on thinking in law-ish terms about ordinary social institutions. So we're having a great time with this. So hopefully there'll be more opportunities. Well, with that, let's call it to a close. It's exactly 4 o'clock on the nose. So Joe, if you're there, we can go ahead and conclude the recording. I want to thank both Saba and Chris for their time today and the super rich detail that they shared with us. So thank you for being with us. And I hope you'll have a great December and holiday break, and look forward to carrying on this conversation in 2022 and beyond.
Sounds great. Looking forward to it.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. It was really enjoyable.
Thanks, Martin.
Thank you so much.